Imagine this. You find yourself stranded on a remote, uninhabited island, no voices, no human presence, just the unsettling cries of wild creatures hidden in the jungle and the endless roar of waves hammering the rocky shore. In those first few days, Selkirk was paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Every sound seemed like a threat, every shadow like an enemy. He realized quickly that if he didn't adapt, the island would swallow him whole. For more than 4 long years, one man endured this nightmare, clinging to life in a fight that seemed hopeless. What follows is the gripping, true account of a castaway whose sheer determination and willpower tested the very limits of human survival. Today, we journey into the harrowing ordeal of one man whose lonely struggle on a forsaken island would later spark the creation of one of the greatest adventure stories ever written. Alexander Selkirk was born in 1676 in the modest fishing village of Lower Largo in Scotland. From early on, it seemed adventure was written into his fate. Known for his fiery and rebellious temper, young Selkirk often found himself in trouble with those around him. Yet it was his restless spirit and hunger for the sea that ultimately set him on the path toward a voyage that would alter his destiny forever. Selkirk's career as a sailor began when he embraced the dangerous life of a buccaneer. In 1703, he signed on with an expedition led by the English privateer William Dampier. Their fleet, sailing out of Ireland armed with letters of marque, had a clear mission: hunt down enemy vessels during the ongoing War of the Spanish Succession. Dampier captained the St. George, while Selkirk served aboard the Cinque Ports under the strict command of Captain Thomas Stradling. The expedition proved perilous from the start. After battling their way through the brutal storms around Cape Horn, the fleet engaged a French warship. Though the clash was fierce, the enemy managed to slip away and warn the Spanish. A failed raid in Panama only deepened their frustrations. Soon after, they captured a merchant ship heavy with supplies, which briefly lifted the crew's spirits. Selkirk was placed in charge of this prize, but their triumph was short-lived. Dampier seized the essential cargo, wine, sugar, flour, and brandy, then abandoned the vessel, leaving the men to press on weary and disheartened. By May of 1704, Stradling and the Cinque Ports broke away from Dampier's command, a split that set the stage for the ordeal to come. A few months later, in September, the Cinque Ports dropped anchor at the lonely island of Masa Tierra, one of the Juan Fernandez Islands off the coast of Chile, to gather water and supplies. It was during this stop that tensions flared. Selkirk had grown increasingly convinced that the Cinque Ports was unfit for the open sea and dangerously close to falling apart. His constant disputes with Captain Stradling escalated until, in an act of desperation, he announced he would rather remain behind on the island than risk his life continuing aboard the ship. Stradling, perhaps eager to rid himself of a troublesome officer, seized the opportunity. Taking Selkirk at his word, he ordered the man marooned. The decision was instant and merciless. Almost immediately, Selkirk regretted his bold declaration and begged to be taken back. But Stradling, determined to assert his authority and make an example out of him, coldly refused. With that, Selkirk was abandoned, condemned to face the wilderness alone. As the Cinque Ports dwindled to a faint speck on the horizon, the crushing reality of his solitude sank in. He was utterly cut off from the world, marooned hundreds of miles from civilization. His only possessions were the meager items given to him before being cast ashore: a musket, a worn hatchet, a cooking pot, a knife, a small set of carpenter's tools, a Bible, a few articles of clothing, and some bedding. With nothing else but these supplies and his wits, Alexander Selkirk's fight for survival had begun. The island was wild, raw, and unforgiving, alive with eerie noises that echoed through the dense jungle and across the rocky shores. In those first few days, Selkirk was paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Every sound seemed like a threat, every shadow like an enemy. He realized quickly that if he didn't adapt, the island would swallow him whole. Survival became his only focus. He sought out food and shelter, eventually stumbling upon a shallow cave near the beach that offered some protection from the elements. There, he lived off whatever scraps he could gather, shellfish, roots, and anything edible he could find. The solitude was crushing. Grief for his abandoned life, loneliness sharper than a sea wind's, and regret over his reckless decision gnawed at him endlessly. He would sit for hours, sometimes days, staring blankly at the horizon, haunted by thoughts of ending his own life, later admitting that suicide had often crossed his mind. But nature soon drove him into action. As mating season came, massive sea lions flooded the beach in great, bellowing herds, claiming the coastline as their own. They blocked his access to food and water, and Selkirk had no choice but to flee into the interior of the island. At first, the idea of entering the dark, untamed jungle filled him with dread. Yet this forced retreat became his saving grace. Beyond the shoreline, he discovered fertile valleys bursting with cabbage palms, wild turnips, and native fruits. These plants quickly became the backbone of his diet, a steady source of nourishment that gave him the strength to endure. Even more valuable were the herds of goats, remnants of earlier pirate expeditions. At first, Selkirk hunted them with his musket, providing both meat and hides. But when his supply of gunpowder finally ran dry, he was forced to rely on cunning and persistence. He taught himself to chase the animals on foot, set crude traps, and eventually tamed a few, keeping them for milk and a more reliable food source. One hunt nearly ended his life. While pursuing a goat across the jagged cliffs, Selkirk slipped and plummeted down a steep drop. He smashed against the rocks below, lying broken and writhing in pain. Days passed as he slowly regained his strength, barely able to move. If not for the goat he had been chasing breaking his fall, the spot where he landed might have become his grave. But cliffs and rocky terrain weren't his only enemies. The island teemed with ruts, grotesquely large, some nearly the length of his forearm. At night they swarmed over him, biting his hands and feet, threatening to infect him with disease. Salvation came from an unlikely source, the wild cats that roamed the island. Selkirk managed to tame them, and they became his nightly guardians. Their presence, though strange, offered him comfort, companionship, and protection in the long, silent nights. Time crept forward. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into months. Alexander learned to live with his solitude. Though he saw no sails on the horizon, he clung stubbornly to hope. Every single day he climbed his lookout point, scanning the waters for any sign of rescue, and he kept signal fires ready to burn. By October of 1704, Selkirk had managed to establish a more permanent home inland, near a freshwater stream. Using the limited tools he had, he constructed simple huts from pimento wood, roofing them with thick thatch. Goatskins served as blankets and bedding, keeping him warm through the nights. He boiled goat meat in his kettle, made fire from pimento wood, and expanded his meals with lobsters, parsley, watercress, and parsnips he found nearby. And through all this, one item became his most precious possession, his Bible. By reading it daily, Selkirk kept his sanity intact. It gave him not only a spiritual anchor, but also a way to preserve his speech and humanity, reminding him he was still a man and not just another creature lost in the wilderness. One day, as Selkirk went about his routine chores, his heart nearly stopped far out at sea. He spotted 2 ships anchored just offshore. His chest swelled with hope. Could this finally be the end of his long exile? He rushed toward the beach, desperate to greet his rescuers. But when the flags and colors came into focus, his joy turned instantly to horror. They weren't English ships, they were Spanish. Selkirk knew all too well what that meant: capture, torture, and likely a lifetime condemned to the brutal salt mines. Stricken with fear, he bolted for the cover of the jungle. The sailors came ashore to gather fresh water and provisions, and at one point a group of them caught sight of him. Muskets cracked through the air as they fired in his direction. But Selkirk, hardened by years of chasing goats over cliffs and sprinting across rugged terrain, darted into the trees with astonishing speed. He scrambled high into the thick canopy of leaves, pressing himself flat against the branches. So close were his pursuers that they relieved themselves beneath the very tree he clung to, completely unaware that their quarry was hiding just above their heads. Hours later, frustrated and empty-handed, they abandoned the search and returned to their ships. Time dragged on, and with every passing season Selkirk's few belongings wore away. His knife, once his most valuable tool, snapped, but from an old iron barrel hoop he salvaged on the beach, he hammered out new blades. His clothing rotted and tore, so he stitched together crude garments from goatskins. They might have looked primitive, but they kept him alive. Years of running barefoot across sharp volcanic rock toughened the soles of his feet until they were as hard as leather. His hair grew long and tangled, his beard thick and unkempt, transforming him into something half-wild, a shaggy, feral figure who seemed more beast than man. Yet even as he adapted to the brutal rhythm of solitary survival, one ember of hope never died. Selkirk never stopped believing that rescue would come. He just didn't know that destiny was already moving toward him. Back in England, William Dampier, the very privateer whose expedition had left Selkirk stranded years before, was once again at sea, this time leading a new fleet to plunder the South American coast. His ships, the Duke and its companion vessel the Duchess, departed on September 1st, 1709. By late January 1710, their course brought them within sight of Isla Masatiera. After 4 years and 4 months of isolation, Selkirk's long wait was nearly over. Cautious from his earlier brush with the Spanish, Selkirk first climbed to his lookout post to study the horizon. On February 1st, 1710, he spotted 2 ships, but this time their rigging was unmistakably British. His heart thundered. He sprinted to the shore, ignited a blazing signal fire, and waved his arms frantically, desperate to be seen. Captain William Dampier, watching from aboard the Duke, noticed the unexpected smoke and dispatched a landing party led by Thomas Dover. When the boat reached the beach, the men were stunned by what they saw, a ragged, sun-darkened figure with wild hair and animal skin clothing, standing speechless in overwhelming joy. After 4 years and 4 months without a single human voice, Alexander Selkirk at last met fellow countrymen. The captain of the Duke, Woodes Rogers, couldn't resist a wry comment, dubbing him with a laugh, the governor of the island. Far from broken, Selkirk had grown strong, lean, and nimble, his body hardened by daily hunts and survival. He quickly proved his worth, helping Rogers revive his crew, many of whom were wasting away from scurvy. Captain Rogers was astonished, not only by Selkirk's physical health, but also by his calm, steady state of mind. He later observed, "One may see that solitude and retirement from the world is not such an insufferable state of life, as most men imagine, especially when people are fairly called or thrown into it unavoidably, as this man was." So impressed was Rogers by Selkirk's resilience and resourcefulness that he appointed him second mate aboard the Duke. The castaway who had once been abandoned to die was now restored to the life of a seafarer, forever changed, but stronger than ever. Once back at sea, Selkirk wasted no time proving his worth. His passion for privateering reignited with full force. In the port city of Guayaquil, today part of Ecuador, he spearheaded a daring raid up the Guayas River. Spanish families who had fled inland with their wealth were not spared. Selkirk and his men plundered their gold, jewels, and valuables with fearless precision. His exploits didn't stop there. Along the coast of Mexico, he played a key role in seizing a massive Spanish galleon, a prize overflowing with riches. Soon after, he rose through the ranks, serving as sailing master under Captain Thomas Dover, guiding the ship across treacherous seas to the East Indies and beyond. Remarkably, his journey concluded with a full circumnavigation of the globe, an achievement only a handful of sailors in history could claim. On October 1st, 1711, Alexander Selkirk finally returned to England after 8 long years away. He was no longer the reckless young man who had once quarreled with his captain and been abandoned on a remote island. He came back transformed, hardened by solitude, and celebrated as a living legend. His story of endurance spread quickly, captivating the imagination of all who heard it. That story would soon leap from reality into literature. Selkirk's extraordinary ordeal inspired Daniel Defoe to pen one of the most enduring adventure novels of all time, Robinson Crusoe. Through Defoe's pages, Selkirk's lonely struggle for survival was immortalized, becoming a tale known across the world. Alexander Selkirk's life remains one of history's greatest testaments to the human spirit. His resilience, adaptability, and unyielding will to survive remind us of the hidden strength each of us carries, strength that only reveals itself when we are pushed to the edge of despair. Centuries later, his legacy still echoes. In 1966, the Chilean government honored him by renaming Isla Más Afuera as Alejandro Selkirk Island, a permanent tribute to the man whose story continues to fascinate, inspire, and haunt us to this very day. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey through history. If this tale gripped you as much as it did us, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more chilling, mysterious, and awe-inspiring stories from the past. Until next time, stay safe and remember, even in the darkest isolation, the human spirit can endure.